The air at the Henderson County Implement Auction hung thick and heavy, a mix of diesel exhaust, stale coffee, and the damp, earthy smell of the thawing March ground. It was 1973, and the mood was electric. Grain prices were climbing higher than anyone had ever seen, and farmers, flush with cash and confidence, were ready to spend. They milled around the rows of machinery like sharks circling a bait ball, their talk a low hum of engine specs and acreage. I was standing near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of my worn canvas jacket, just watching. My name is Arthur Miller, and the 240 acres my grandfather broke with a team of mules was now mine. I wasn't here to buy big. I was looking for a set of cultivators for my old Farmall M, maybe a parts tractor if one went cheap enough. That's when I saw Ray Peterson. You couldn't miss him. He was holding court by a brand new, gleaming International Harvester, 1076, its paint a shade of red so bright it hurt the eyes. The tractor still had the plastic on the seat of its enclosed cab. Ray wasn't buying it at auction. He'd driven it here straight from the dealer to show it off, a peacock spreading its feathers. He was younger than me by 10 years, with a confident smile and the soft hands of a man who lets bankers and machines do the heavy lifting. "Things got a turbo, Art," he called over to me, his voice dripping with condescension. A few of the other farmers turned to look, a slow grin spreading across their faces. They knew my reputation. "Pulls a 7-bottom plow without even breathing hard. You ought to trade in that old M of yours. Hell, they might give you $50 for scrap." The laughter was quiet, but sharp. I just gave a slow nod. "She still runs, Ray. That's all I need." "Runs?" he scoffed, slapping the massive rear tire of the 1066. "Art, this isn't about just running anymore. This is about progress, efficiency. I just signed the papers on this beauty, a new 7-15 combine, and a 6-row planter. $60,000 of the finest machinery money can buy. The bank was happy to do it. Said a man's got to expand, got to modernize." $60,000. The number hung in the air, seeming to suck the oxygen right out of it. That was more than my entire farm was worth just 5 years ago. It was a king's ransom. I looked at the 1066, at its air-conditioned cab with a built-in radio, at the complex array of hydraulic levers. It was a spaceship compared to my simple, open-station Farmall. My father's voice echoed in my head, a low rumble from years past. "Debt is a yoke, son," he'd told me 100 times, his hand stained with the same grease that now lived under my own fingernails. "You put it on your own neck. The banker holds the reins, and he'll drive you wherever he pleases, straight into the ground if it suits him." He'd paid off the farm during the Depression by working himself to the bone, and he died in his own bed, in his own house, owing no man a single dime. He'd left that legacy to me. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant started up, and the crowd's attention shifted. They were selling off old man Hemlock's things. He'd passed away over the winter. I saw a rusty set of 2-row cultivators, the exact type I needed. They were from the 50s, but the steel was good. A little time in the shed with a wire brush, some new shovels and a splash of paint, and they'd be good as new. I waited. The bidding started at $5. I let it go up to 10, then 15. When the auctioneer called for 20, I raised a finger. Ray Peterson, who had wandered over, let out a loud snort. $20, Art? You gonna break the bank on that pile of rust?" "Going once as going twice," the auctioneer sang. Another farmer, a friend of Ray's, yelled out, "25! Just for the sport of it, just to make me pay." I held up my hand again. 30. My voice was quiet, firm. A silence fell for a moment. They were looking at me, at my patched jacket, and my worn-out work boots. They saw a man clinging to the past, a man too stubborn or too scared to join the new world of big-time farming. The auctioneer banged his gavel. "Sold! To Art Miller for $30. As I walked over to pay the clerk, Ray clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to feel friendly but felt like a shove. "You see, Art, that's the difference between you and me. You spend your afternoon buying $30 junk. I spend mine investing $60,000 in the future." He walked away, followed by his small group of admirers, their laughter trailing behind him. I handed the clerk 3 worn $10 bills, got my receipt, and went to hook the old cultivators to the back of my pickup. The steel was cold and solid in my hands. It wasn't an investment in the future. It was just a tool. But it was my tool. Paid for. No strings attached. No banker holding the reins. As I drove home, the late afternoon sun glinted off the chrome exhaust stack of Ray's new tractor, a brilliant flash of red and silver. My own farm looked small and quiet as I pulled in. The barn needed a coat of paint, and the house my grandfather built was modest. But it was all mine. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to stop and ask you all a question. Have you ever known a man like me? A man who would rather spend a week with a wrench and a busted knuckle than a single minute signing papers in a banker's office? Maybe it was your father or your grandfather, a man who believed that the only thing you should owe is a good day's work for a good day's pay. Let me know in the comments below, because I'm starting to feel like men like that are a dying breed, and I'd like to know I'm not the only one who remembers them. That spring was wet, one of the wettest in memory. The fields were swamps until late May. For men like Ray Peterson, it was a source of constant frustration. I'd hear the deep, guttural roar of his new 1066 as he tried to work the ground, its big tires churning the black soil into a useless muck, leaving deep ruts that would plague him all season. His big, heavy equipment was his enemy. My old Farmall M, however, was light on its feet. With its narrow front end and modest weight, I could get into the fields a full week before Ray. The sound of my tractor was a stark contrast to his. It wasn't a roar, it was a steady, rhythmic bark from its 4-cylinder engine, a sound that had been the heartbeat of this farm for over 20 years. I didn't have a cab. The wind whipped at my face, and the sun beat down on my neck. I could smell the rich, turned earth, feel the vibration of the engine through the steel seat. I was part of the work, not sealed away from it in a glass box. I got my corn in the ground while Ray was still fighting the mud. The coffee shop talk, which had been all about Ray's new iron, shifted. Now they talked about the weather, and a few of the older farmers would nod in my direction. "Art got a jump on it," they'd say. Sometimes those old ways ain't so foolish. But my victory was short-lived. Just as I was finishing up the last field, I felt a shudder run through the tractor. A sharp, metallic bang echoed from the engine, followed by a sickening grinding noise. The steady bark devolved into a chaotic clatter. I killed the ignition immediately, my heart sinking into my stomach. I coasted to a stop at the edge of the field, the silence suddenly deafening. I slid off the seat and looked at the engine block. A dark, viscous line of oil was weeping from a crack just below the manifold. It was a long, jagged fissure, like a lightning bolt carved in cast iron. My hand went to it, and I could feel the heat and the sharp, cruel edge of the broken metal. This wasn't a simple fix. This was catastrophic. I walked the 2 miles home, each step feeling heavier than the last. The next morning, I had Tom Henderson, the head mechanic from the dealership in town, come out to look at it. He was a good man, honest as the day is long. He wiped his greasy hands on a red rag, poked and prodded at the engine, and finally stood up, shaking his head slowly. "She's done, Art," he said, his voice gentle. "Looks like you threw a rod, and it punched its way out. The block is cracked clean through. To get a new block, have it machined, get the parts, you'd be better off buying a new tractor." As if on cue, Ray Peterson's 1066 roared past on the road, pulling a massive field cultivator, turning the soil with an ease that looked almost arrogant. He saw us standing there, saw my dead farmel, and gave a slow, knowing smirk before disappearing over the hill. "I can't afford a new tractor, Tom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Not even a used one right now." "Well," Tom sighed, kicking at the front tire, "the only other option is to find a used block at a salvage yard, and that's a long shot. Even if you find one, swapping everything over, it's a monster of a job. Most folks would just send her to the scrapyard." He left, and I stood there alone with my broken machine. The smell of raw gasoline and hot oil filled the air. This tractor had been my father's pride and joy. He'd bought it new in '51. I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk of its engine. Sending it to the scrapyard felt like burying a member of the family. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle, the weight of the world on my chest. My wife, Helen, knew something was wrong. She laid a hand on my shoulder. "What is it, Art?" "The M is finished," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Tom says it's scrap." She was quiet for a long time. "And what do you say?" I thought of my father. I thought of Ray Peterson's smirk. I thought of the $30 cultivators sitting in the barn. I say Tom's wrong. The next winter was the longest of my life. After the harvest, which I managed to finish using my neighbor's smaller John Deere 420 in exchange for a week of my labor, the Farmall M became my sole focus. I didn't have a heated shop like Ray Peterson, just my barn. A single bare bulb hung from a rafter, casting long, dancing shadows. My only heat came from a small pot-belly stove in the corner that devoured wood and offered little warmth in return. I started the teardown. Every morning before the sun was up, I'd be out there, my breath pluming in the frigid air. The work was slow and brutal. Bolts, rusted tight by 20 years of weather, fought me every step of the way. I'd soak them in penetrating oil, heat them with a torch until they glowed cherry red, and then lean on a breaker bar with all my weight, praying the head wouldn't snap off. My knuckles were a permanent roadmap of cuts, scrapes, and bruises. I drained the fluids, the coolant smelling sickly sweet, the oil black and thick. I pulled the radiator, the hood, the gas tank, laying each piece out on the concrete floor in a specific order. Then came the head, a heavy, greasy beast of cast iron that I had to wrestle onto a workbench. The pistons were scored, and the rod on number 3 cylinder had snapped clean in two, its jagged end the culprit that had murdered my engine block. The hardest part was splitting the tractor, separating the engine from the transmission. It was a job meant for 2 men and a proper gantry crane. I had only a chain hoist, some heavy timbers, and sheer, stubborn will. The day I finally managed to roll the front half of the tractor away from the back half, I felt a victory as profound as any harvest. I found a used engine block at a salvage yard 3 counties over. It was sitting half buried in the mud behind a mountain of scrap metal. It cost me $200, every cent I had saved from the summer. I spent 2 weeks cleaning it, checking it for cracks with dye, honing the cylinders until they were smooth as glass. Piece by piece, I began the reassembly. I installed a new crankshaft, new bearings, new pistons and rings. Every bolt was torqued to the exact specification listed in the worn, oil-stained pages of my I&T shop manual. It was a slow, meticulous process. I was no master mechanic, just a farmer who couldn't afford to pay one. I learned as I went, making mistakes, cursing, and starting over. The town watched my winter project with a mixture of pity and amusement. The men at the coffee shop called my barn Art's Folly. Ray Peterson would drive by slowly, shaking his head at the sight of my dismembered tractor, a monument to what he saw as my backwardness. He'd bought another 80 acres that fall, the parcel just north of me, signing the papers with the same easy smile. He was the king of Henderson County, and I was the court jester, playing with my broken toys in a cold barn. Helen was my rock. She never questioned me. She'd bring me hot coffee in a thermos and a sandwich for lunch. Her presence, a silent statement of faith that warmed me more than the pot-belly stove ever could. "You'll get it, Art," she'd say simply, before heading back to the house. Finally, in the last week of February, with the snow still thick on the ground, it was done. The tractor was whole again. The paint was a patchwork of old, faded red and the greasy, dark grey of the salvaged block, but it was solid. I filled it with fresh oil and new coolant. I hooked up the battery, my hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from nerves. I climbed onto the steel seat, the same seat my father had sat on for thousands of hours. I took a deep breath, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. The engine turned over once, twice, a heavy, sluggish groan. It coughed, it sputtered, and then it caught. It wasn't a roar. It was that same familiar, rhythmic bark, smoother and stronger than I'd ever heard it before. It was the sound of resurrection. I let it idle for a few minutes, the exhaust smoke filling the cold barn with a sweet, hazy fog. I engaged the clutch, shifted into gear, and slowly, carefully, drove my Farmall M out of the barn and into the winter sunlight. I had done it. I had stared into the abyss of failure and debt, and I had wrestled my way back with my own 2 hands. I didn't know it then, but that long, cold winter in the shed was the best investment I ever made. The next few years were the golden age of American farming. The mid-70s brought grain prices that made the boom of '73 look like a dress rehearsal. Land that had sold for $500 an acre was now fetching $2,000, then $3,000. The banks, eager to loan against this inflated equity, were handing out money like it was candy at a parade, and no one had a sweeter tooth than Ray Peterson. He was the poster boy for the new era. His operation was a testament to the mantra of, "Get big or get out." He'd bought the quarter section to the east of me, then the 80 to the south. He was farming nearly 1,000 acres now. To work it all, he traded in his 1066 for a brand new International 14-6, a true monster, with a turbocharged diesel engine that you could hear from 2 miles away. Then came a 4-wheel drive Steiger, a massive articulated beast that made my little Farmall look like a garden tractor. His grain bins multiplied, silver rockets gleaming in the sun. He built a new ranch-style house for his family, set far back from the road, and a heated machine shed that was bigger than my barn and house combined. Every time I went to town, I'd see his new pickup truck, then another one for his hired man. He was on the board at the co-op, the president of the school board. People listened when Ray Peterson talked. He spoke of cash flow, depreciation, and tax advantages. He talked about farming as a business, not a way of life. He was winning, and everyone knew it. And me? I was still Art Miller, the man with the old tractors. My rebuilt Farmall M ran like a top. I'd added a used John Deere 4020 to my fleet, a solid, dependable tractor from the 60s that I'd bought for cash from a retiring farmer. It was a big step up for me, but to Ray, it was an antique. While he was planting with a 24-row planter, I was still using my 6-row. While he was harvesting with a new combine that could cut a 30-foot swath, I was chugging along in my old John Deere 95, taking 12 feet at a time. The money was good for me, too. The high prices meant that even my modest yields were bringing in more cash than I'd ever seen. But I treated the windfall like a skittish horse. I didn't trust it. I remembered my father's stories of the brief boom after the First World War and the devastating crash that followed. So I did the only thing that made sense to me. I paid my bills. Each year, I'd use the profits to buy my seed, fertilizer, and fuel for the next year, paying cash up front. I replaced the roof on the barn. I put new siding on the house. I bought Helen a new Chevrolet, the first new car we'd ever owned. The rest of it, the vast majority, I put into a savings account and certificates of deposit at the Henderson County Savings and Loan. Mr. Henderson, the bank president, would shake his head when I came in. "Art, you're a good man," he'd say, adjusting his spectacles. "But this money is lazy. It's earning you 5, maybe 6%. Ray Peterson is borrowing money at 8% and making a 20% return on it with this new land he's buying. You have to make your money work for you." "My money is working, Mr. Henderson," I'd reply. "It's working on a good night's sleep." He'd just smile a sad little smile and stamp my deposit book. The community saw my discipline not as wisdom, but as a lack of vision. I was the fool who had a winning lottery ticket and was too scared to cash it. I was a relic, a stubborn old mule standing in the middle of a superhighway destined to become roadkill. At the coffee shop, the talk was always about who had bought what new piece of land, who was driving the biggest tractor. My name never came up. It was as if I had become invisible. One fall afternoon, I was out in the field, working on a fence line. Ray pulled up in his shiny new pickup, the window gliding down with an electric hum. "Still playing with barbed wire, Art," he said, a familiar smirk on his face. "Fences need mending, Ray." "You know, I just closed on the old Johnson place," he said, gesturing with his thumb over his shoulder. "That gives me land on 3 sides of you now. You're becoming an island." He leaned his arm on the windowsill. "I'll make you a fair offer for this place, Art. A good offer. You could take the money, move to town, buy a little place in Florida for the winters. You wouldn't have to bust your knuckles on this old junk anymore." I looked at him, at his clean shirt and his confident eyes. He didn't see a home, a legacy. He saw a square on a map, a parcel to be absorbed. He saw a problem in his otherwise perfect empire. "It's not for sale, Ray," I said, turning back to my fence. "It's never going to be for sale." He shrugged, the smirk turning into a look of pity. "Suit yourself, but when land hits 5,000 an acre next year, don't come crying to me. My offer won't be on the table forever." He powered up his window and drove off in a cloud of dust. That evening I was in my shed, greasing the combine for the last day of soybean harvest. The radio was on, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. A man with a deep voice was talking about the economy. He used words I didn't fully understand, words like inflationary spiral and monetary policy. Then he said something that made the grease gun in my hand feel cold and heavy. He was talking about the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a man named Paul Volcker. He said this man was determined to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. He said interest rates were going to go up, and that they were likely to go up a lot, and fast. I turned off the radio and stood there in the quiet of my shed. The air smelled of oil and dust, and the promise of winter. Across the road, the mercury vapor lights of Ray Peterson's massive operation blazed against the twilight sky, a beacon of progress and prosperity. But for the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of strength. It looked fragile, like a beautiful glass house on the edge of a cliff, with a storm gathering out over the dark horizon. And I could feel the wind starting to change. The summer of 1980 was a scorcher. The sky turned a pale, hazy white, and the sun beat down with a physical weight, pressing the life out of everything. The corn, which had shot up tall and green in the wet spring, began to suffer. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture, turning a sickly, greyish green. The rain simply stopped. Ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud. The creek slowed to a trickle, then disappeared altogether, leaving behind beds of bleached white stones. Ray Peterson's 1,000 acres were a monument to the drought's cruelty. His new hybrid corn varieties, bred for high yields in perfect conditions, were thirsting to death. They were engineered to thrive on precise amounts of fertilizer and water, and without the water, the fertilizer in the soil was just burning up the roots. Driving past his fields, I could see the stalks turning brown from the bottom up, the ears small and poorly filled. The sheer scale of his operation now magnified the scale of his impending failure. My own corn didn't look great, but it was surviving. I'd always saved back a portion of my own seed from the best ears of the previous harvest, an old-fashioned practice Ray had laughed at. "You're giving up 20 bushels an acre with that junk seed, Art," he'd told me once. But my open-pollinated corn had deeper roots and a hardiness born of generations of adaptation to this very soil, these very weather patterns. It was shorter, the ears weren't as uniform, but it was alive. It was hanging on. The heat and the stress seemed to get into the machinery too. Metal expanded, hoses grew brittle, and old weaknesses revealed themselves. One sweltering afternoon in August, I was replacing a worn-out sickle bar on my old John Deere 95 combine when I saw a cloud of black smoke billow up from over the hill, from the direction of Ray's place. It was followed by the kind of silence that only comes after a very loud noise has suddenly stopped. A few hours later, Ray's pickup tore into my driveway, spitting gravel. He jumped out before the engine was even off. His face was streaked with soot and grease, his eyes wide with a kind of panicked fury I had never seen in him before. "Art, you got a heavy-duty hydraulic puller?" he asked, his voice strained. He didn't even say hello. "Might have," I said slowly, wiping my hands on a rag. "What's the trouble?" "It's the 1480, he bit out, referring to his new axial flow combine, a machine so advanced it looked like it belonged on a different planet. The final drive went out, stripped the splines clean off the axle shaft. I've been trying to pull the hub for 3 hours with a sledgehammer and a chain. It won't budge." I walked into my shed and came back with a heavy steel box. I opened it to reveal a big, greasy Porter Power puller set. Ray looked at it like a drowning man looks at a life raft. "I'll bring it right back," he said, grabbing the box. "Keep it as long as you need," I told him. He was back an hour later, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He set the box down gently. "Thanks, Art. But it's no use. The whole thing is seized solid. The dealer mechanic just left." He kicked at one of my tires. You know what he said? He said the whole planetary gear assembly is shot. Said it got so hot, it basically welded itself together. I just nodded, waiting. They have to order the parts from the regional depot in Moline. It'll take a week to get here, maybe more. And the cost? He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. $8,000 for one final drive. That's more than you paid for that whole 40/20 tractor of yours. He stood there for a moment, staring at my old combine, at the simple chain and sprocket drives that I could fix with a set of wrenches and a few master links. He looked at my shed, at the tools hanging in their proper places on the wall, at the workbench littered with the guts of some small engine I was tinkering with. For the first time, he wasn't looking at it all with pity or condescension. He was just looking. "The bank is already screaming about my operating note," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Now this. $8,000 I don't have, for a crop that's half burned up in the field." He got back in his truck and drove away, leaving me there in the long, golden shadows of the late afternoon. The drought was the first crack. The broken combine was the second. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me despite the heat, that the whole dam was about to break. The whispers had already started in town. People were talking about the grain embargo President Carter had put on the Soviet Union that January. It was meant to punish them for invading Afghanistan, but it was the American farmer who was paying the price. The bottom had fallen out of the market. Corn that was supposed to bring $3.50 a bushel was now struggling to fetch $2. It was a perfect storm, a devastating drought, soaring operating costs, and a collapsed market. Ray Peterson was sailing a mighty ship, but he was sailing it straight into the teeth of a hurricane. The fall of 1981 was when the hurricane made landfall. The news from the Federal Reserve was the talk of the coffee shop, but nobody was smiling anymore. Paul Volcker's war on inflation had sent the prime interest rate into the stratosphere. It climbed to 15%, then 18%, then an unbelievable 21.5%. The variable rate loans that had financed the entire expansion of the 70s, the loans that had built Ray Peterson's empire, were now ticking time bombs. His operating note, which he renewed every year, came due. The bank, which had once treated him like a king, now looked at him like a liability. They renewed his loan. They had to, but not at the 8% he was used to. It was renewed at 19%. The math was brutal and inescapable. The interest payments alone were more than most farmers made in a year. That's when the auction notices started appearing in the paper. At first, it was just a few names on the margins, guys who had always been overextended. Then, the names became more familiar. Men I'd known my whole life. Good farmers, hard workers, who were being crushed under the weight of debt they'd been told was good business. Every sale was like a funeral. Farmers would stand in tight, silent groups, their hats in their hands, as a stranger's life was sold off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder. They were watching their own future, and they knew it. Ray held on longer than most. He was bigger, with more assets to leverage. But it was like trying to patch 1,000 leaks in a sinking ship. He sold off the Steiger four-wheel drive first, taking a huge loss because the market was flooded with desperate sellers. The money was a drop in the bucket, barely enough to cover the interest payments for a few months. He let his hired man go. He tried to work the 1,000 acres himself, running day and night. The fatigue was etched on his face. His confident swagger was gone, replaced by a frantic, hunted look. I'd see the lights of his 1466 in the fields long after midnight. I'd hear its engine strain and roar as he pushed it, and himself, past the breaking point. He was a proud man, too proud to ask for help, and we were all too scared, too busy trying to keep our own heads above water, to offer it. The final blow came in the spring of '82. The bank refused to extend him any more credit for seed and fertilizer. His line of credit was maxed out, and the value of his land, the collateral backing it all, had plummeted. The $2,000 an acre land was now struggling to get a bid of $800. His equity was gone. He was, in the cold, hard language of the bank, insolvent. One Tuesday morning, the notice was tacked to the courthouse door. The foreclosure sale of Peterson Farms, Inc. It listed everything: the land, parcel by parcel, the machinery, piece by piece, the house, the bins, the tools in the shop, an entire life itemized for liquidation. I survived because I was an island. The waves of the crisis crashed all around me, but they couldn't touch me. I had no debt. My operating costs were a fraction of Ray's. I paid for my fuel and seed with cash from my savings account. The low grain prices hurt. There was no doubt about that. There was no profit to be made, not in those years. But my goal wasn't profit. It was survival. My farm wasn't a business that needed to show a quarterly gain. It was a home that just needed to endure. I remember one afternoon, I was in the shed, grinding the valves on the engine of my old pickup truck. I was doing the work myself because I couldn't afford to pay a mechanic, but also because I had the time. I wasn't farming 1,000 acres. I had the time to maintain my own equipment, to keep the old iron running. Helen came out with a glass of iced tea. She stood for a moment, watching me work. "I saw Sally Peterson in the grocery store today," she said quietly. Sally was Ray's wife. She was using food stamps. The words hung in the air of the workshop, heavier than the smell of grease and steel. Food stamps, the final, quiet indignity. "They're losing the house and everything," Helen continued, her voice thick with emotion. "They have to be out by the end of the month." I stopped my work, the valve-grinding tool going silent in my hand. I looked around my shed at the rebuilt Farmall M sitting in the corner, a silent, red sentinel. I thought of that winter, the cold, the busted knuckles, the ridicule. I thought of Ray's smirk as he drove past in his new tractor. There was no triumph in me, no sense of "I told you so." There was just a profound and terrible sadness. The game had been rigged, and Ray had played it with all his heart, only to find out the house always wins. The banker holds the reins, and he will drive you straight into the ground if it suits him. My father's words had become a prophecy, and the prophecy had come true. The day of the Peterson auction was cold and grey for a day in late May. A damp wind blew across the farmyard, whipping the auctioneer's flag and chilling the crowd to the bone. The whole county was there, it seemed, not with the excited energy of the implement auctions of the 70s, but with a somber, morbid curiosity. They were here to witness the public execution of a man's dream. Ray's machinery was lined up in neat, funereal rows. The massive 1466, the 1480 combine, the fleet of wagons and ploughs. It all looked so powerful, so permanent. But it was just iron, and the numbers on a banker's ledger were stronger than iron. I saw Ray standing near the back of his oversized machine shed, his own shed, now just another asset to be liquidated. He wasn't the Ray Peterson I knew. He was a ghost, gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow. He was watching strangers poke and prod at his life's work, their faces grim, looking for a bargain born of his ruin. I didn't go there to buy. I had everything I needed, and it was all paid for. I was just there to bear witness. The auctioneer started with the small items, the tools from the workshop. A rolling toolbox full of expensive snap-on wrenches sold for a pittance. Power tools, welders, things a man needs to hold his world together, were scattered to the four winds for pennies on the dollar. Then the auctioneer moved to the land. The parcels Ray had bought during the boom years, the ones he'd bought on contract at high interest rates, went first. They sold for less than half of what he'd paid, the bank taking a catastrophic loss, but a loss they could absorb. Ray just stood there, flinching with every rap of the gavel. Finally, they came to the last parcel. The original 80 acres. The home place. It included the new ranch-style house, the big machine shed, and the grove of oak trees his grandfather had planted. This was the heart of it all. The auctioneer began his chant, his voice echoing off the silent silver grain bins. The bidding was slow, hesitant. The bankers were there, ready to bid it in for the bank if it didn't bring enough. A few of the bigger farmers, the ones who had been more cautious and had survived the crash, made a few bids. The price crept up slowly, agonizingly. I saw Sally, Ray's wife, standing by the kitchen window of the house, watching. Just watching. I thought of my own home, the modest house my grandfather had built with his own hands. I thought of Helen and the security we had, a security not measured in dollars, but in the simple fact that no one could take it from us. And in that moment, something shifted in me. It wasn't pity. It was a sense of duty, a sense of stewardship for the land and for the community, however broken it was. This wasn't just another piece of dirt. This was a man's home. I felt my hand go up. "I have a new bid," the auctioneer shouted, his eyes finding me in the crowd. "From Art Miller." A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned. Ray's head snapped up, his eyes locking with mine. I saw confusion, disbelief, and maybe for the first time, a flicker of something else. The other bidder, a big operator from the next county, looked over at me, annoyed. He raised his bid. I raised him back, my voice quiet but firm when the ringman asked for my number. We went back and forth. The price climbed higher than anyone expected, higher than the bankers had hoped. It was every dollar I had saved, every penny from those boom years that I had tucked away, my lazy money that Mr. Henderson had worried about. Finally, the other farmer shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer's chant rose to a crescendo. "Going once, going twice, sold to Art Miller." The gavel fell, and the sound was like a thunderclap in the sudden silence. I owned Ray Peterson's home. I didn't walk over to the clerk's table right away. I walked through the quiet crowd, straight to where Ray was standing, leaning against the cold steel wall of his former shop. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the gravel, his jaw tight. "I don't want your charity, Art," he said, his voice rough. "It's not charity, Ray," I said. I pulled a folded piece of paper and a pen from my pocket. It was a blank rental agreement I'd gotten from the lawyer in town that morning. "I'm not a 1,000-acre farmer. I can't work this ground myself. I need a good tenant." He finally looked up, his eyes swimming with a mix of shame and disbelief. "A tenant?" "The rent will be a third of the crop, just like always," I continued, holding out the paper. "You stay in the house. You use the shed. You farm this 80 like it's your own. You're a good farmer, Ray. You just got caught in a bad storm." He stared at the paper, then at me. He didn't take it. He just stood there as a single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He nodded, a short, sharp jerk of his head, unable to speak. That was enough. Over the next few years, the farm economy slowly began to heal. The prices never returned to the dizzying heights of the 70s, but they stabilized. The rains came back. The land endured. Ray farmed that 80 acres with a focus and a passion I'd never seen from him before. He became a better farmer on 80 acres than he ever was on 1,000. He didn't have the newest equipment. He bought older, smaller machines at auction, paying cash. He learned to fix them himself. I'd often see the lights on late in his shop, and I'd wander over. We'd stand there, two farmers in our 50s, talking about a stubborn engine or a problem with a gearbox. We never talked about the auction. We never talked about the money. We didn't have to. We talked about the work. We were rebuilding more than just machinery in that shop. The community changed too. The talk at the coffee shop was different. The swagger was gone. The talk of getting big and borrowing money was replaced with talk of efficiency, of marketing, of survival. They spoke of my decision not as a strange act of charity, but with a kind of quiet reverence. They had all seen the abyss, and they had seen me bridge it for one of their own. My reputation as a stubborn old fool was gone. In its place was something else, something I'd never sought. Respect. Years passed. My hair turned from brown to grey to white. My hands, gnarled by work and time, grew stiff in the mornings. I never bought another acre of land. My 240 acres was enough. It had provided for my grandfather, my father, and me. It had given my family a good life. My son David came home from college with a degree in agronomy. He had new ideas, but he had my father's caution in his blood. He loved the land, not for what it could produce, but for what it was. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found him in the old shed. He was standing in front of the Farmall M, which was now more of a retired family heirloom than a working tractor. He was tracing the jagged, brazed line on the engine block where I had repaired the crack all those years ago. "Grandpa told me about the winter you spent in here, Dad," he said, his voice soft. "He said everyone in town thought you were crazy." "Your grandpa was probably right," I said with a smile, leaning against the workbench. "No," David said, turning to face me. "They were the crazy ones. They thought they were buying progress. They didn't realize they were just renting it." He looked at the tractor, at its simple, honest design. "You know, I was looking at the new tractors at the dealership. They're amazing. GPS, computers, they practically drive themselves. But the dealer told me you can't even change the oil without a diagnostic laptop. The company can shut the tractor down remotely if they want to. You buy it, but you never really own it." He ran his hand over the faded red hood of the M. You own this. Every bolt, every wire, it's yours." I looked at my son, and in his eyes I saw the lesson had been passed down. It wasn't about the machinery, new or old. It was about the yoke of debt. It was about the freedom of a paid-for life. It was about understanding that the land doesn't belong to the person with the biggest tractor, but to the one who holds it in trust, free and clear, for the next generation. Ray Peterson eventually bought the 80 acres back from me, paying me exactly what I had paid for it, with no interest. We shook hands on the deal in his kitchen, two old men who had been through a war together. We were friends. I still go out to my shed most days. The smell of old oil and cold steel is the smell of my life. Sometimes I just sit on the seat of the old Farmall, my hands on the smooth, worn steering wheel. I think about my father and the simple, powerful truths he taught me. I think about Ray and the high price of ambition, and I feel a deep, abiding peace. The storm came, and the storm passed, and we were still here. The land was still here, and that was, and always will be, enough.